Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. I am Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Hey there. Well, virtually joining you.
Yes, this is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we're really thankful that you're joining us, and we are so excited to talk about 2011 Contagion.
You may have picked up on the fact that Anthony and I are not physically in the same room right now, so we apologize. We know that'll impact the sound quality a little bit, but we are doing our best to keep social distancing in effect as we are recording this episode during COVID-19.
Yeah, as of today, which I think we can just go ahead and say that we're recording on March 26th, 2020, so we're truly right in the middle of this whole COVID-19 outbreak. So we are recording from separate locations, but we still wanted to bring you this podcast and keep going as best as we could. But we took a little bit of a break, and that's why we hadn't been releasing some episodes. It's not because we've gone away. It's just because, well, the coronavirus did impact us.
Yes, and that's why, uncoincidentally, we are talking about Contagion today. You may have noticed that normally in the little intro I say each episode looks at a specific horror text. I couldn't say that this time because I'm not entirely sure that I think Contagion is a horror text, but it is, I think, still giving us nightmares. And so we'll just sort of talk about this film and talk about it through the lens of a podcast that is specifically focused on what it means to have sources of horror and to depict monsters and things like that. And then Anthony and I will discuss whether or not this should be counted as a horror film and why that might matter in light of how we're approaching this current situation.
Yeah, because I think it's going to be impossible to kind of talk about this without also talking about real world events. I know most of the time we try to not bring in a bunch of real world stuff as to not date our podcast, but this is one that's going to inevitably, we're going to have to date it.
Yes. And I think that the next couple episodes, actually, will be a little bit more set within the time in which they are released, just because this is what's on people's minds. And horror becomes a way to both, I think, tackle some of these issues, but also I think it becomes a way to sometimes problematically present them. And so we'll kind of be exploring all of that in the next little while.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you said that, because that's actually a lot of, in my research on Contagion, that's what a lot of what I found about the actual writing. So I guess I'll just go ahead and get on into it.
Yes.
Contagion, 2011 film, directed by Steven Soderbergh. Ensemble cast, as you may have guessed if you've seen the film: Rena Coulter, Matt Damon, Lawrence Fishburne, Jude Law, Gwyneth Paltrow, Kate Winslet, Bryan Cranston, and Jennifer Ely. Bunch of big name stars in there, even the ones you may not have heard of, like Jennifer Ely. She's a Tony Award-winning actress, so everyone in there has done some pretty incredible big things. And to follow all of these plot lines, the film makes use of the multi-narrative, hyperlink cinema style that Soderbergh uses in many of his films to just follow all of these different characters around. And the writer of this film, Scott C. Burns, this is actually not his first time working with Soderbergh. They collaborated 2 years before. Soderbergh had collaborated with the screenwriter Scott Z. Burns before, 2 years before, in 2009, on their film The Informant. And Burns discussed doing a medical thriller film depicting the rapid spread of a virus inspired by the pandemic, such as the 2002-2004 SARS outbreak, which is the severe acute respiratory syndrome outbreak, and then the 2009 flu pandemic that was going on right around the time of The Informant's release. And in order to do this, Scott C. Burns talked a lot about the extensive amount of research and the development of this idea. So he talked about this in an interview with ComingSoon.net. He talks about how while Steven, and himself were working on The Informant, they decided that they wanted to do another movie together. So they originally decided that they were going to do a movie about Leni Riefenstahl, who I had no idea who this was, German film director and actress. And so when Burns started doing research about this, then one day Steven called him up and said, you know what, I don't think anyone's going to see a movie about Leni Riefenstahl because nobody knows who she is. And he'd rather make something that people might want to go and see. So he asked Burns if he had any other ideas. And so Burns was like, I'd always wanted to do this movie about a pandemic, but not, he was very insistent that it wouldn't be like these other pandemic movies. He wanted to have it firmly rooted in reality.
Can I just say that, like, I am glad that we have the film Contagion, but I personally would have been really excited by a film about Leni Riefenstahl because I think that she's a very, like, and I know that I'm in the minority.
You are a person you're a big German person.
I am. And also she's just kind of, I think that, like, if anyone's listening, I think we deserve a movie on her because of just that part where, you know, I mean, she gave us Triumph of the Will, and we get to see some of the most beautiful footage that I think is shot during World War II. But then, you know, there's that whole, like, when she realizes how bad the Nazi party is and she realizes she's been their chief, you know, film propagandist, you know, just that, like, moral dilemma of, like, what do I do? Like, that is actually a film that I think I would pay good money to see. So, Contagion, yay, happy we have it. But I still want that Leni Riefenstahl film.
There's still time. Someone can still do it.
True.
It just didn't happen to be Steven Soderbergh or Scott Burns in 2009 after making their film The Informant. So there's a funny scene in The Informant where Matt Damon is watching another character talk, and he sees one of them cough on the phone. And then Matt Damon goes off on this rant saying, oh, great, now what happens? He gets sick, and then I'm going to get it. My kids are going to get it. And so Burns was like, he'd always been fascinated by the transmittability of viruses. And so when he told Steven Soderbergh about that, Steven Soderbergh was like, yeah, that sounds great. So they decided that they would collaborate and make that. And so during the research, he came across this scientist with an incredibly funny name, Dr. Larry Brilliant. That is his real name.
Yeah, how cool is that? You know, like, how cool is it to have a last name that, like, you can be like, yes, I am, bum, bum, bum.
I had a percussion teacher who his last name was Best, so it was Mr. Best.
How cool is that? Tresca, Troyer, those don't mean anything. Brilliant? There you go.
That's a name, and he is a very brilliant person. So he did this TED Talk about the pandemic disease, and the point of view of people within his field isn't if this is going to happen, it's when this is going to happen. And as someone who lives in 2020 now, this guy was right. Dr. Brilliant, he was correct. So Burns collaborated with Dr. Brilliant and a bunch of other different scientists who Dr. Brilliant put him in contact with during the research project. And he actually started researching this film 6 months before the H1N1 outbreak happened, which Burns said was actually really helpful to his research because he got to see how society in real time was reacting to this pandemic that was going on. And he saw all of these issues being brought up that are come up in the film, like, do you close the school? And if you close the school, then who stays home with kids? And where will everyone keep their kids at home? And then the stuff online with Jude Law's character, that spreading of information with people wanting to be ahead of the curve. So people write these things about antivirals or different treatment protocols, and there's always information, and that information also has its own viral pulse, just a different kind of viral, you know what I mean?
Stop it.
And so he said, and I think this quote is really, really interesting, so it's not just the disease you have to track, it's how the disease is interpreted by the population. Now, I think this is a very telling quote about the film, and also is very accurate.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think that when we get into our discussion about does this film count as horror, I think that quote becomes really important because it allows for us to see that there are potentially two sources of horror. And I think one of them actually allows the film to maybe be counted as a type of horror film, whereas the other does not. And I just think that's a really important sort of framework to keep in mind.
So basically what we're saying is remember that quote. It's going to be kind of important. So a little bit more about the actual filming of it. Steven Soderbergh said that he had one really essential rule that he carried throughout all of filming. It's that you can't go anywhere that one of the characters hasn't already been. So they're not going to cut to a city or a group of extras that we're not going to have seen or know personally or been to before. And he says it's a really significant rule because in a movie where you're trying to give a sense of something that's happening on a large scale, we also want it to be centered around these real people that we know because, yes, it's big and it's happening everywhere, but the point of this film is also that it's happening to individuals and people as well as the society as a whole.
And this is actually, I think, really groundbreaking in terms of a decision to make by a filmmaker, because when I think about what some of the biggest differences are between how narratives are told in film versus how narratives are told in fiction, it's that we often have these shots of places that our main characters have not yet been, where we are going to see extras doing things. And we much more rarely have that in our fiction because we kind of have been trained that in fiction, you're not going to have a lot of characters that aren't going to continue past a couple of pages.
Yeah, he likens it to the disaster films of the times where you just see these big shots of just all of these people who their only purpose is to just be killed and die. He's like, we don't want any of that. It's implied that there are going to be lots of people who are dying. We keep saying that. So there's no need to have those shots. Those are just, he just didn't see any need for it. And so because of that, he also had this philosophy of trying to keep everything simple. He shot the entire film with only 2 lenses.
Wow.
And he didn't get any. So he talks about how he covers the hell out of everything and just is we'll get a shot from here, 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 here. But this movie, he just kept it very, very simple. And he just didn't want to have any of those extra shots. He was like, we only want to have what we absolutely need to have and keep it simple so you pay more attention to the performances rather than any flashy camera tricks that he's doing. And then one thing about this film that's very, very interesting is just how accurate it is. So the film was actually fact-checked in 2011 when it came out by a CDC expert who said that the film was mostly accurate, with the biggest mistake actually being the scenario that Contagion presents in which the vaccine is developed in about 4 months. He says that in the case of an entirely new virus emerging, that developing a vaccine that fast would be extremely unlikely. It would, assuming that a vaccine could be created, it would take far more time than 4 to 6 months to create.
And, at least they made it 4 months, right? I always think about the CSI shows where they're we'll take this back to the lab. And then 20 minutes later, they're the killer was Bob, right? So, we have to have some, I think, liberties for it to be still an engaging story, still a Hollywood story. But yeah, it's a film that I think, and actually one of the reasons I'm not sure that this should be considered a horror film is because of the fact that I think the science component is used to undermine the source of horror that is potentially the Contagion. And so for me, I think that because it's so scientifically accurate, not that horror couldn't be really accurate, but I think that the way the film frames the science in this movie makes it so that we shouldn't be considering it horror.
Yeah. I was watching this film with a science person last night, and she said that the most horrifying part about this film was how fast they rushed through the clinical trial portion of it. It's how do we know this would work at all? It worked on this one lady. This is horrifying on a mass scale. And I was just interesting that that's the thing you're focusing on.
Yes. Actually, there's a really good series by an author named Mira Grant that it's a zombie novel series. And the premise of that is that the way that the zombie plague descends upon the land is because of lack of clinical trials, because someone creates a vaccine to cure the common cold, someone else creates another one to cure cancer. This activist group ignites it, releases them simultaneously, and when they work together, it creates this zombie virus.
What is that called?
So the series is called Newsflesh, and I actually think you'd really like it because on top of zombies, it's actually about this news crew following a presidential candidate around, because we still have politics.
Oh.
Yeah. We still have
so
politics.
It's called Newsflesh.
I think that's the first book, but that's what the series is called. And so it's them following around what would, this post-apocalyptic world look like when we've now still put in our, political system, which is very, I think, apropos for what's going on right now, where we still have to decide, are we going to, let COVID-19 affect our election system? So yeah, I think you would like the series. I really enjoyed the series, but also a recommendation to our listeners. Yes, and excellent. And if you like it, Anthony, we can talk about it on a future podcast episode. But yes, I think lesson learned, especially for humanists, always let the scientists finish their clinical trials, because otherwise, zombies. Yeah, or a faulty vaccine. Whichever one. So this film was released at September 3rd, 2011 at the 68th Annual Venice International Film Festival, and then had a wider release on September 9th. It was made for around $60 million and grossed $136.5 million worldwide. And while it was really well received and pretty popular in its time, the most interesting thing about this film, I think, right now is the renewed popularity that it had today. In 2020, the film received a bunch of renewed popularity due to the corona pandemic, which bears resemblance to the pandemic featured in the film. In March 2020, Contagion was the 7th most popular film on iTunes, listed as the number 2 catalog title on Warner Brothers, compared to where it was previously at number 270 in December, and had an average daily visit on piracy websites increased by 5,609% in January compared to in December. Wow. And then one of the people who worked on the film, who was a veterinary pathologist, Tracy McNairman, she was an advisor to the film. She talked about the film in 2020. She's like, if people are watching it again, and if federal and state officials are watching it again, I hope they're realizing the movie was really about what can happen with a novel pandemic threat. And I think people should have taken it much more seriously. I wish people had paid closer attention to it when the film came out, because it was really a warning to the federal government that this could happen to you and you need to prepare. She goes on to say, I wish I could be optimistic about this, but we've been warned by many viruses before, H1N1, monkeypox, the West Nile, and so many other diseases. I think the lesson that will come out of this is that we need to have another look at how we respond to rapidly evolving novel disease threats. And, there's been a lot of stuff right now on Larry Brilliant as well, right? And so there's an article that came out on March 2020, by Foster Kamer in Futurism. And he begins his piece by saying, every major global crisis has, in retrospect, its Cassandra, a doomsdayer with the terrible curse of being the one person to see the mess coming, but who gets brushed aside by the larger public. And then he says, for the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, that person is epidemiologist named Larry Brilliant. And then he says, Larry Brilliant didn't just help eradicate smallpox. He didn't just help advise the movie Contagion. He didn't just apparently tour with the Grateful Dead for a summer, but he also, he had a 2006 TED Talk, and recently in an interview... That's the one that Burns based. He got a lot of inspiration for the film. Yeah, that would make sense. That would make sense. And recently, right, Brilliant was interviewed and said the whole epidemiological community has been warning everybody for the past 10 or 15 years that it wasn't a question of whether we were going to have a pandemic like this. It was simply when. It's really hard to get people to listen. And I think so that's kind of confirming the Contagion, which I don't remember when it first came out. I don't remember seeing it. I don't remember really hearing about it. I don't know what I was doing that I wouldn't have been aware of it, but it wasn't really on my radar. I remember seeing it. I saw it when it first came out, but it didn't really make a big impression on me. Like, I forgotten about so much of it until I did my rewatch. Like, I didn't remember how it ended. I didn't remember, like, huge chunks of the film. I just remember, I saw it at a drive-in. I just remember, I remember seeing it. Yeah. That was the extent of it. So I remember my most distinct memory of it comes from, I taught a class that was called Health and Global Cinema, and it was 2 people who were already registered nurses who were working on their Bachelor of Science in nursing. And I used that film first as the sort of American film before we would go to all of our other films from across the world. And it was the most thrillery of the bunch. And I chose it in part because I wanted to talk about like how Hollywood tends to depict health as opposed to, say, other nations, which are often taking a sort of more introspective look. I think now we have more American films that do that. But because I think about that film in conjunction with these other films, I always think about it as being a little bit, not over the top, but Hollywoodized, like kind of this extreme thriller version of things. And it really, it'd be interesting to teach that class today, where we would have to acknowledge Contagion as being a lot less just to entertain you and a lot more to warn you.
I think that's the scariest part of the film. Like one of the scariest parts is just how accurate the film ended up being today. It shows you how well Burns did his research. I think that is the best thing about the film, is because it has gone on to be just, it got so many points correct.
Yes. And I won't lie that there are scenes that are haunting. The one where we realize how many things we touch, and like how you should never, ever, 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 ever eat any nuts that are in a mixed bowl, at a bar, right? Like, there's so many moments in this film that really, I think, do a good job of creating a sense of like scaring us. But I'm going to argue that I think it's really important that we don't consider this film horror, even as we allow certain things, including the realism and the scientific accuracy, to scare us.
And I think I'm going to take a little bit of the other side of this issue. I think it could potentially be considered a horror film, but not if you are viewing the source of horror as the virus from the film. I don't think it falls under horror if it's that, because I don't think that's the true thing that the filmmakers are trying to say is the source of horror, and I don't think that's what would make it classify as horror. I think that this film would only fall under the lens of being horrific if we view the most scary part of this film to be human nature, and what happens when human nature in a time of crisis is left to be kind of unchecked and runs rampant.
So I'm going to agree with you. I am...
Nice. Discussion over.
Insofar as I think that things change when we think about the humans. But before we get further into our discussion, I think it's worth talking really quickly about why it may matter or not that we view this as horror. Because I think that, as always, it's really important that you and I, the conversations we're having, that they're not just academic for just, like pure debate's sake, but that there's an underlying like significance to why we feel so passionately about what we feel passionately about. So you know very well, Anthony, and podcast listeners, you probably have picked up on the fact that I feel often very mixed about like generic definitions as a like, that there should be a single definition of what science fiction is. There should be a single definition of what horror is. And
classifications are in themselves limiting.
Yes, I think classifications are limiting, and I think classifications are having a debate for debate's sake.
Yeah.
I think that most of the time it's not about like a larger thing. It's just like, I'm right, you're wrong, or let's just discuss this in our beautiful ivory towers while the rest of the world is crumbling to pieces around us.
It's a very privileged thing to get to talk about.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it. But twice now, because I did this with Midsommar as well, and I'm going to do it with Contagion, I'm going to argue that while it is not necessary to always have a perfect generic definition that you can just kind of show in its perfect form, it is important, and it is not about privileging, it's about its sort of deeper understanding to decide if a specific text meets a classification for a genre.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think that is important to consider, particularly because I think with this one, more so than Midsommar, it is a lot more clear what the significance is to our discussing it. We are quite literally in the time of a pandemic, and so whether the classification of this as horror or not can kind of color the way people might see the actual coronavirus and see what's going on. And so I think it is really important to consider why we're talking about this at all.
And I have seen this film, popping up on people's lists of, like people will say, what are the horror films we should be watching right now? And Contagion is topping that list. And I think, again, like you said, it shapes explicitly how we are interacting with both the concept of the virus itself, but also the social isolation and quarantining, as well as our interactions with other humans. And I think that as you may be able to make an argument that I'd be willing to buy, that people are the real monster, because you'll always be able to get me out with that. I think even accepting that as like, this is a horror film because people are monsters is also a problem. So let's go through. Let's start. Would you read that quote again that we said will sort of like determine how you see this film?
Here we go. Here's the quote. So it's not just the disease you have to track. It's how the disease is interpreted by the population.
Okay, so let's talk about why neither of us feel like this should be considered a horror film when it comes to tracking just the disease. You go first.
Well, okay. So I think that just like classifying this and like talking about this only through the disease and saying that that is the source of horror and that is why this film is scary it's not, first of all, it's not super relatable because we didn't have this exact strand of the virus. It's not the same thing when happening in the real world. Also, like you did mention a little bit before, some of the reaction to it is a little Hollywoodized. And so I think that, and the rush for the vaccine and how quickly that is made, and the happy ending, how everything just kind of gets wrapped up in a nice little bow in terms of the handling of this specific virus, is not super scary, and it's not really horrifying. It's not the virus that provokes any of the true, what I feel are horrific moments from this film. It's present for it, and it definitely spurs it on. But I think the virus is more of a plot device, or something to push something that allows the horrific moments to happen based on what I'll ultimately say is deeper human nature and just human reaction to this at all. So that's why I don't think that just discussing this through the lens of the virus is the most effective way to go about having this conversation.
I agree. I think that especially because by the end, it seems like the global crisis has been resolved and everything is better now.
Yeah.
Now, there are films that I think are horror, like World War Z, that do that still, right? That they're like, we found the cure for zombieism. So I'm not saying that it isn't done in horror films, but I think that the reason we can't see The Contagion in and as a source of horror is because of the fact that this is a film that is saying that we don't need to fear this because we have a hero in science. Science never fails us in this film. And I don't think you can really have a source. Now, scientists, right, they may fail us, but because science is not praised, because science becomes the superhero of this film, I don't think that the virus can be a source of horror.
The only potential, I think, like what you were saying, like you can have affirmative horror where everything gets wrapped up in a nice little bow. That's just that, like we've talked about on other episodes before. That's the whole thing. Like that's Stephen King's playground. Things are bad, but things go back to the way things were, and things are better now. And I think you could view that. You could look at this film through that lens, but I don't think that's the most interesting or most productive way to look at this film, particularly right now.
So you were telling me before the episode started that you were going to try to make an argument, and I was going to not fully believe you, for this film being possibly affirmative horror if we're looking at humanity or the lower ends of humanity as our source of the monstrous. Would you explain how you see that as being a way that this film could maybe be horror?
So remind me what the name of the author is who gives the 7 theses of what makes a monster.
It's Jeffrey Jerome Cohen.
Yeah, that's the guy. So I think that building off of some of what he talks about as his theses of what makes a monster, humanity weirdly fits a lot of these theses. So the monster is supposed to be a cultural body. It's quite literally, this virus is affecting the larger cultural body. It can't be killed. You can't kill human nature unless you just kill all humans, which doesn't happen. One of his other theses is that it always escapes. Human nature does come out of this untarnished, pretty much. Things just keep on going. So I think that using those three main theses, what makes a monster, is what I think will ultimately help me argue that it's humanity that fits more of this monster role in contagion rather than this virus, because I don't think the virus really fits a definition of what makes a monster.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, Cohen and lots of other, sort of monster theorists, it's a hotly contested issue of whether or not we can count humanity or humans as monsters, right? And you'll always have people that will be saying things like, well, what about an American Psycho? There's always, right, exceptions that people raise, or serial killers in the real world. But if we suspend the discussion of whether or not humans can be monsters and just say that in this case, in this film, that's the closest thing we have to a monster, I'm willing to agree with you on that. I'm also willing to say that, you don't have to look far to find similar examples in our current world where people are hoarding and not being very kind to each other. We have lots of examples of the opposite, right? Of people really reaching out and building a sense of community, the number of companies that are offering resources to students and faculty, and to those that are in the classification of higher at risk. But we definitely have examples of the lowest parts of humanity and contagion happening now.
And what I think is most interesting about, if we view the source of horror as humanity and human nature, is not just the more obvious things that the film presents to us. Like, yes, obviously the reporter, Jude Law's character, is clearly profiting off of it. And yeah, that we see people profit off of horrible pandemics and times of crises all the time. I mean, the U.S. government has a real big tendency to help facilitate and allow that to happen. And that's just like a nature of how capitalism works. You profit, always, always, always profit. And I think that's a really obvious one. But I think another one is the less obvious parts of human nature. Just like, we willy-nilly touch things all the time without really thinking about it. Like, we're so willing to just trust that these peanuts in a bar are fine. Yeah, sure, they're out there. I can eat them. I can. And that's a bit of a flawed part of human nature. It's not a bad thing inherently that we're so trusting and just so willing to touch doorknobs and do all these things, even though we know that we shouldn't. Or we don't always wash our hands, even though we're told from a very young age that we should always wash our hands and be as clean as possible. So I think it's not just the big, like, humanity's profiting off of this, or politicians give special treatment to their close families. Like, those are the obvious problems with human nature. But I think what Contagion really gets right and shows about this, and is what's really horrifying, is some of the smaller, more minute things about human nature.
Or the things that are seemingly independent of the contagion, such as the realization that it is through our deforestation acts that we are, bringing this onto ourselves, right? That by deciding that we are going to take over the world in the ways that we do, we're, ensuring that we're going to have exposure to new things, right? Like, that is, I think, also one of the really important components of the film.
It's like how scientists are talking about how the melting of the ice caps that we're doing are releasing old bacteria into our system, and potentially older diseases that our current, how we've evolved, has never been exposed to, and so we won't be prepared for that when they come out of these ice caps that are being unfrozen. So it's just how we interact with the world has a direct effect on things.
I feel, as I did with Midsommar, that while I want to see this film as horror, while I think that there are certainly horrific elements, I think it undermines what the film is trying to do, though, to see this as a horror film. And I think that in light of current circumstances, it's actually very dangerous to see this film as a horror film, because then we see the humanity as the monsters that we need to be fearing. And it's not just that, like, we need to be kind to each other and things like that. I feel like so much of what the horror genre allows us to do is to use a metaphor and a framework for understanding things that are happening around us. But if we view this film as a horror film, I think it's too close. Like, we can't see it as a metaphor. We just see it as an actual statement about our world today. And that's not what horror really, I think, when it's at its richest, is doing. It's not saying this is a exact understanding of the world around us. It's, here is a way to understand the world around us. And I think that as long as we see Contagion as a horror film, we're not digging appropriately into the issue that we're facing in the real world.
I don't know. I think that you can't. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because I think that part of, like, I'm go back to the quote that the veterinary pathologist Nick Nairman said about how she wished that people had taken this film more seriously and seen what the film was more accurately trying to say. It's not that human nature is 100% bad and will do all these terrible things. It's that we just need to take things like this more seriously, and because so much of it is just, like, of human nature, is that we just avoid it until it's a big problem, like what we have right now. Like, we defund the CDC until there's a global pandemic. And so we haven't done the things that the film was saying. Because I think you look at the film and you can be like, yes, bad, it's a terrible thing. We've had things like this happen before, and then just put it away. But I think what the film was saying is, like, there's little preventative things that we can do to kind of counteract this human nature that we have, this, to just ignore and just assume the best and just go on with our lives. So I think that's the way that you can look at it, and it can still kind of be classified as a horror. I mean, it's obviously not horror in the typical sense. I mean, this entire argument is kind of saying for a more liberal definition of what horror is, but horror is all about pushing boundaries.
I 100% agree with everything that you're saying, but I feel like you're actually supporting, for me, why I think this film should be instead seen more as a medical thriller, because if we're going to see it as a cautionary tale, if we're going to see it as something that is not a way to look at the world, as in through a metaphor or sort of like a something between us and the real horrors of the world, if we're supposed to actually see it as, like, learn from this is a script of what you can and cannot do, to me, I don't think that's what good horror does. I don't think good horror translates quite so obviously over from what you're supposed to be feeling and understanding and doing to the real world. I think that it serves more as this, like, in-between state.
So horror should only operate as a metaphor then?
I don't know if it should only operate as a metaphor. I think that good horror, though, complicates the situation and asks us to unpack it, and then to see how that analysis allows us to reflect on real world issues. I don't think Contagion is complicating things or asking us to unpack it. I think it's saying, here's how it is. What are you going to do about it? And so to me, I think when I think of what really qualifies as, like, the horror that I feel resonates the most with me and with other people that I talk to, it's the kind that complicates and requires unpacking, as opposed to just, like, just slap it onto reality and that will solve things.
It's too black and white for you. It's like, and I get why you might be hesitant to agree to this kind of label, because then it'd be like, well, wouldn't all Holocaust films be horror films as well? But I can see the argument both ways, because I can see, yeah, Holocaust films are extremely horrifying. They're truly horrific. They showcase monsters. Sorry if anyone doesn't think Nazis are monsters, but I think they do fit all of the theses of what makes a monster, and I think they are one of the things of, like, how the theses can be applied to humans pretty aptly. But I can see the reluctance to not want to classify things like that, because I guess it's this debate of, like, how real can horror get?
And I think that horror absolutely can and should not always be super far away, right? Like, I don't think it should be like that you have to be like, well, there was a giant bunny, and really the giant bunny is, embodying our sense of our fear of death, which is really stemming back to, like, I don't think it should have to be that far removed every time. I just think that what makes Contagion a film that we need to be watching now is not the fact that it is scary, and it is not the fact that it is horrifying us. It's the fact that it is telling us, here is how to address this issue that is scary. Here's how to frame your world so that you're making smart decisions in a time when there feels like you have no decisions that you get to make on your own.
Yeah, and I can very much see that, and while at the same time also acknowledging the fact that I think that some people, and I'm completely understanding why people would want to view this as a horror film, because it's hitting particularly right now why you would want to interpret it as a horror film, because it hits so close to the horrors that are currently going on, and it's really like in a very head-on way, kind of holding up a mirror to exactly what's happening right now, which is something that we often talk about what good horror does. Like, it reflects this cultural body and like this zeitgeist of what we fear in the current time. And I think what most people are afraid of right now is this pandemic that's currently going on. And so it makes sense why it pops up on lists of like most engaging horror to watch right now, or stuff like that.
No, I agree. I think you're absolutely correct that it makes sense why people are watching it. I think people should be watching it. If the way to get people to watch it is to tell them it's a horror film so that they'll watch it and then ponder it, I think that's great. And again, I think what's most important about this film and about this discussion is that we need to think carefully about how we're going to think about Contagion, and that it can't just be the movie we put on in the background because we want to be scared, or the movie that just scares us and so we just go, well, that's too horror, I can't watch it. Because I think that neither of those reactions are where this film needs us to be, to see it as, again, a timely statement about everything that from start to finish of this pandemic.
So thanks so much. That has been our discussion on Contagion. I hope that I'm about to make a terrible joke. I hope that you will pass this on, like the virus from the film, to all of your friends. This is something that you can feel good about sharing with other people in this time of crisis.
I'm glad to know that while you may be physically far away, you still are able and willing to share your puns.
I had to do it. I was like, oh, this is kind of a downer of an episode. I haven't made as many bits or jokes as I normally do.
No,
but
we'll have to remedy that.
I had to bring it back at the end. At least get in some type of joke.
Yes.
Even if we are maintaining social distancing, doesn't mean I have to do social joke distancing. I can still do it. I can still do it. So, in the meantime, feel free to go back and listen to any of our other podcasts, share us with your friends, and come back next time. As we said, we are altering our release schedule a little bit. I know that we said in our previous episode that the next episode was going to be The Exorcist, but we feel like there are some other films that, in light of everything that's going on, that we just need to talk about more. So the next film that we're going to be talking about is actually 2020's The Invisible Man.
And this is a great film to be looking at, in part because so much of the things that are emerging in terms of COVID-19, but also just sort of any global crisis situation like this, is that there's always someone that is that Cassandra, right? Who no one believes, but is telling the absolute truth. And The Invisible Man, while obviously not being at all about COVID-19, is still, I think, addressing a lot of the fears and concerns that are emerging right now in light of everything that's going on.
And The Invisible Man is available if you weren't able to catch it while it was in theaters, before all theaters have now shut down for good reason. It's available on video for demand, so you can get it on iTunes, Amazon, any place like that. And so that you can watch it before next time, when you'll hopefully be joining us for our horrifying discussion of The Invisible Man.
In the meantime, we want to encourage you to tell us on social media what you think about Contagion. Do you see it as a horror film, and why is that important? Or do you see it as not being a horror film, and why might that be important? Because I think what's perhaps the most significant thing we can be doing right now is having conversations. So thank you so very much.
And we will see you next time when we talk about The Invisible Man.